Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Expat Chat. This is number 4 in the series. And these are the Blevins Franks podcast where we seek to get answers to the questions that we think or we believe that you probably don't ask about. So last week we discussed what proved to be a very popular subject with most listeners, succession and inheritance. So we've generated lots and lots of questions, but lots of those were specifically about property and property ownership. So I think we need to address that this morning. So James, is the process of buying a property different in France?
Yes, it is very different to the UK, but I'm probably not the best person to be speaking to about property because I've only ever been stung on property purchases and property sales. So I'm not the biggest fan of property unless you live in it. But yeah, it's very different. So in the UK, you can back out of a transaction all the way up until you've kind of exchanged contracts, and it seems that more and more solicitors in the UK are now exchanging contracts and completing on the same day. So one of the reasons why I don't like the UK property market and that kind of situation was because I had my buyer back out on the day of completion. So they decided 3 days before Christmas, after I kicked out my tenants, that they weren't going to buy the house. And it knocked a whole chain of about 5 properties out. So there's no kind of security there in the UK with how your either your purchase or your sale is going, because until you've exchanged contracts, it's you're free to make a change of your mind. Whereas in France, we have a bit more of a structured process. So even to make an offer in France, you generally have to make a written letter or email confirming what your offer is to purchase a property. Once that's accepted, you both instruct notaires or solicitors over in France, and with them they will produce a kind of a pre-contract or a compromis de vente, and this will be signed in the presence of the notaire with both parties involved. Once the seller has signed this, they will be locked into the sale. When the buyer signs it, they have generally a 10-day cooling off period where they can change their mind. Within that 10 days, they have to lodge a roughly a 10% deposit, although that can be negotiated with the seller. And then once that 10-day cooling off period is ended, everyone is kind of tied into the sale and the purchase. And from there, there will be a contractual completion date, which is normally around 2 to 3 months after the signing of the compromis de vente. So you get more security that once you have gone through that process of signing the compromis, each party is tied in, and there's a financial penalty if each of them drop out, which I believe is a bit more like the Scottish way of doing things in the UK, whereas England and Wales have the former scenario that I mentioned, where they can change their mind up until exchange of contracts.
So you guys bought French property much more recently than me. Do you have any top tips for our listeners?
Top tips. What can I tell you on that? Right. Well, I think the big thing to consider is if you're buying a French property, be aware that there is between 7 and 8% notaire fees when you buy. That's sometimes comes as a shock to people. It's quite a big initial charge on your investment. So that's one reason you need to make sure that you're buying the right property. I think that during the buying process, it's a good idea to have your own notaire, your own notary. With every property purchase in France, there's always at least one notary involved. We would normally suggest having your own so that you've got somebody representing you and the seller of the property has somebody representing them, because it just avoids the situation where potentially the notaire is in cahoots with the seller. I think also, if you're buying a property, speak to the notaire about marriage regime. You can speak with Blevins Franks about this as well, but certainly when you're buying the property, that's something that you should be looking at. And also, tontine. There's a particular clause that you can put on a property which protects the last survivor. In terms of tips and advice, that's all I've got for now.
I've got another couple of things actually that I did on my property. So I bought a property 2 years ago now, and what I was able to do is when the seller is selling the property, what they tend to do is they add the estate agent's fees on top of the price of the property. And they pay it themselves. And what I requested to do is to pay the agent's fees, which tends to be 5 to 6% of the property value myself. So I wrote a check out for the agent's fee from my own money, and it reduced the amount that the property purchase was liable to taxation. Because as Tom said, the notary fees of 7, 8, 9% are liable on the property value. But if you're giving the property value including the agent's fees, you're increasing the taxation that you'd pay on that. So by writing a check, which is quite hard for me to do given the amount estate charge in France versus what a UK estate agent would charge, and that did save me quite a little bit of money on the notaire's fees. I'd also arranged to have a few of the pieces of furniture that were in the property, so rather than including that just in the total price of the property, we carved out a certain amount for the furniture and the kind of things that were staying in the house, and that again reduced the total purchase price of the property and therefore reduced the amount of notaire's fees that I paid on it. So in the end, I think I saved about 6,000 or 7,000 euros by doing that, which isn't a huge amount, but actually it helped me with a young family try and do some renovation work. So it is worth looking into.
I think what both of you have touched on is the fact that actually buying property in France is quite expensive, and you really just don't want to make a mistake, because you make a mistake. One of the things that we frequently find is that people move to France and they go and live where they've been on holiday, but actually then when you live there all year round, you then find out that it's actually not somewhere that you want to live all year round, so that you're then into another set of costs and charges for moving on. Do you come across that frequently, Tom? Do people decide that they need to move on? A lot of people move to France and go and live in what was their holiday home, then find out it's not where they want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they're in a position of having to sell that and buy somewhere else. I suppose the only good thing about that is if they do come to live in France and that they want to sell the property, it is tax-free, because in France the rule is that if you're selling your main residence, it's a tax-free transaction.
Absolutely, yeah. So James, us Brits, we love buying property wherever we go in the world. Is it still a good investment?
Us Brits, apart from me. Yeah, I mean, it can be. You're banking on the value of the property going up significantly, though, which in the UK has been good over the years. But actually, with the succession or the capital gains tax rules in the UK for overseas residents, there's only capital gains tax on a deemed value from 2015 when overseas CGT was introduced to the sale price. And actually, we're seeing more and more that properties in London have got no gain from that 2015 valuation to now. And you couple that with the fact that UK rental income generally isn't a great yield when you consider the costs and the tax involved. We've just had the 6th of April this year an additional 2% income tax on rental income. So it again reduces that yield down, and we now have had the renters' rights reform. So people are trying to have unfortunately kicked tenants out. We've been aware of situations where they've literally got rid of tenants, so they weren't going into this new renters' rights reform with sitting tenants. So it's getting tougher to make a profit on UK property, UK rental property. In France, I don't think property purchases or property is a great investment vehicle. The increase in value of properties is very slow and steady in France. It's not like we've had in the UK over the years. I've got a client that lives over in the Var who actually bought a property, I think it was 22 years ago now, around 22 years ago. Unfortunately, the property burnt down. They rebuilt it with the insurance money, and they're now trying to sell it. It's not worth any more than what they paid for it 22 years ago. So it just shows that property values can be quite static here. So, I mean, I think as well, if you couple that with succession tax planning, there's very little you can do with property and retain flexibility with the asset. So if you combine the growth versus the income it generates and then the succession tax, I think there are better options right now available to you.
James just mentioned succession when obviously when somebody dies. So how is a property tax when the owner dies?
Okay, all right. Well, let's look at this from the point of view of somebody who's a French resident, who's maybe got a UK property. So if somebody's got a UK property, then that property, when they die, will first of all be assessed for UK tax, because HMRC has the first rights of taxation on UK assets. So that will be assessed for 40% inheritance tax. There's an allowance of £650,000 for a property that is not a main residence. But then once it's been assessed for UK inheritance tax, you've got French succession tax as well. Now, there is a double taxation treaty, so you can offset one of the liabilities against the other, but ultimately you end up paying the higher of the two liabilities. And bearing in mind, French succession tax can go up to 60%, depending on who inherits. There can be quite a liability. So if somebody's retaining UK property, that's something to consider. It's a similar story when it comes to French property. You haven't got the UK tax applying there in most situations for a French resident, but you've still got to contend with French succession tax. And as James alluded to before, there aren't really any kind of breaks for succession tax when it comes to your French property. So that's where if somebody is really trying to optimize in terms of succession or inheritance, we normally look to ask them to consider using other assets.
James, lots of Brits, when they move to France, they actually keep the property in the UK, maybe as a bolt hole just in case things don't work out as they expected it to, and then they start renting it. Is that a good idea?
I do actually think holding that UK property for at least a period when you move to France is a good idea. I mean, you test the water, see if you like living in France, and if you do, then you can look to sell the property. It just gives you that kind of safety net that if you do make the jump over the channel, that you can return fairly easily. You've not got to find a place to kind of live again. So from a security point of view, I think it makes a lot of sense when you first move over to keep that property. But with the UK situation now, having a renter in your property and the rights that they have is everything I read and everyone I speak to that's got UK properties at the moment that are rented, they're looking to get out. They don't want to have that liability in the property. The returns are not good enough to justify the risk as a landlord now. So no, it's not a great option. Having said that, as a protection to keep it available to you while you first move, I do think it's well worth doing.
But if they retain that property and then sell it a bit later on, is there not a crossover point when the tax in the UK starts to exceed the tax in France?
Yeah, so when you sell a property in France, as Tom just said, you get, if it's your main residence when you sell it, there's no taxation at all. In the UK, it works slightly differently. So while it's your UK main residence, there's no tax. But if it was not your main residence for any period, that will be liable to taxation. And there's an apportionment between resident time and non-resident time. So the longer you don't live in that property, and if it goes up in value, the more that taxation is going to be. If you're living in France at the time, you also then need to consider the French rules as well. So given it won't be your main residence from a French point of view, you'll have French capital gains tax on it. And depending on how long you've owned that property, you could have a large French liability and a large UK liability. The difference is that UK liabilities tend to increase over time because it's not your main residence, and you'd hope the property value goes up a bit over time. That tax liability gets bigger and bigger. Whereas from a French point of view, the capital gains tax decreases over a 22-year period to zero. So you're going to get this kind of crossover at some point where your UK tax is going up and the French tax is coming down. And there's going to be an opportune time to get rid of or offload that UK property.
So, Tom, if I own a UK property and then I sell it after I leave the UK, how does the tax work?
Yeah, well, I think James kind of answered part of that really well there. I mean, there is a window of opportunity. Once you leave the UK, you've got 9 months in which the sale of your UK property is free of both UK and French tax. So that's something to bear in mind. If you go outside of that window, then effectively you could be on the hook for UK capital gains tax. As James mentioned, you get relief for periods of occupation where you've been living in the property. But if you haven't been living in the property, or there are periods where you haven't been living there, then those periods are subject to UK tax. From a French perspective, the French system isn't really cared about periods of occupation or non-occupation. If you are not living there at the time of sale, then they will look at the whole gain and they will consider that to be taxable. Having said that, in France, we do have a system whereby if you've owned a property for a certain number of years, then the taxable gain on that property does decrease. And after 22 years, it becomes tax-free if you're selling it. and after 30 years, it becomes exempt from social charges as well, and it's on a sliding scale. So again, a complex area, and anybody who is thinking about selling a UK property, who is living in France, might want to come and have a chat to us, because it's an area that we're able to provide some guidance in.
Sorry for labouring this point a little bit, gentlemen, but James, there are different rules for maison principale and maison secondaire.
Yeah, there are. So maison principale, your main residence, you will have, if you're the owner, you will have a taxe foncière to pay. So it's basically an owner's tax. A few years ago now, they phased out what was taxe d'habitation. So basically, it was kind of similar to a council tax, but they phased that out for main residences. So this maison secondaire will have the taxe foncière if you own the property, and you will also have that taxe d'habitation, because it is still applicable to second residences. So there's a difference there. Also, from a UK perspective as well, one thing that the UK has now done, if you have a UK a house or apartment accommodation available to you, it's up to the local council. They can charge up to 4 times council tax to try and deter people from holding these kind of holiday homes. So yeah, there is a difference both in the UK and France versus it being your main residence and a secondary residence.
Tom, as a result of today's conversation, it just sounds really expensive and really complicated to carry on in property now. From a succession perspective, are there better asset classes to be owned?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question we get asked all the time. We say to people about the downsides of retaining UK property, and the follow-up question is usually, well, what do I do then? If I sell the property, what do I do with the proceeds? And fortunately, there are structures that you can use as a French resident. Quite often we'll set them up in neutral jurisdictions such as Luxembourg or the Republic of Ireland. And effectively, if these are set up in the correct way, they can be exempt or partially exempt from French succession tax. And if you're clever about how you structure them, if you structure them in the right way, potentially the whole lot can be exempt from succession tax. So yeah, absolutely, there are different ways of achieving that.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, James. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the 4th edition of the Expat Chapter. Wherever you download your podcasts, if you could like and subscribe to us, and if you want to know more about Blevins Franks or find out what's going on here, you can always visit us at www.blevinsfranks.com. So this week we touched on property, when you sell property, and we touched on it slightly today. I think we need to explore capital gains in a bit more detail next week. So join us then for any information you're looking for on capital gains. Thank you very much.
And goodbye.